Well, hello and welcome to Ultimate World War II, part 29. Okay, this covers Africa and Europe, 1942, and this is part 1. Okay, where I will conclude on 1941 with the start of Operation Crusader, and then go straight into 1942. Just 1 second. Certainly not going to have that crazy sound going off in the middle of my video. So, basically, Operation Crusader, okay, is launched on November 18th, okay, 1941, by the British Army, the 8th Army, commanded by General Cunningham. Basically, the main goal of the attack is to relieve the siege on Tobruk, okay, by Italian and German forces, to recapture the district of Cyrenia, and if successful, to even invade Tripolitania. Now, I do think that is a bit of a crazy way of thinking. You know, Afrika Korps and Rommel there now, and the Panzers there now. It's not going to be as easy going as it was to overrun Cyrenia against the Italians in 1940. Okay, but the British 8th Army, okay, advances without meeting any serious obstacles and reaches Sidi Rezegh. Okay, however, on the left flank at British line, okay, the Italian Ariete Division puts up stout resistance. Okay, well, on the right flank of the 8th Army, the 4th Armored Brigade is involved in hard fighting with contingents of the German 21st Panzer Division. Many great battles were fought in North Africa, with the arrival of the Afrika Korps to try and shore up the collapsing Italians. It was certainly a front that goes a bit under-recognised, except for main battles like El Alamein, etc. Now, the British moved the 22nd Armoured Brigade, okay, from Bir El Goubi to Gaba Saleh to meet the threat from the Germans. Also, towards end of November 1941, General Weygand, okay, is dismissed as Delegate General of Vichy France in North Africa because he's not really cooperating with the Germans, okay. Now, as the British 7th Armoured Brigade, okay, starting from Gaba Saleh, approaches Tobruk, it is attacked by Rommel's panzers and loses a massive 113 of its 141 tanks. So basically, that tank brigade has pretty much been relieved of most of its armour in one swift counterattack by Rommel's panzers. Meanwhile, in Italian East Africa, the Italian garrison near Gondar, commanded by Colonel Augusto Ugolini, surrenders to the British. Meanwhile, also towards end of November, there's heavy fighting between South African 5th Division and the 21st Panzer Division, okay, near Sidi Rezegh. Both sides suffer large losses in fierce fighting. So basically, the population of Saint-Pierre, meanwhile, okay, votes by plebiscite to recognise change of government from Vichy to that of de Gaulle. Now, the decision is not a very welcome one in the United States, which has not yet recognised General de Gaulle as the leader of the Free French nation and still maintains diplomatic relations with the Vichy government, which is surprising. Meanwhile, in December 1941, British commandos attacked German bases on Norwegian coastal islands. In all, some 16,000 tons of shipping are destroyed by the British commanders. And meanwhile, Eden meets with Stalin and Molotov in Moscow to discuss cooperation both during and after the war. It's just a shame, really, that cooperation after the war went sour as quickly as it did. Also, towards the end of December 1941, okay, the Anglo-American delegates at Washington Conference obviously called for establishment of a single command in Far East, which I mentioned before, in which General Wavell is appointed in overall command, which is quite ridiculous, really, considering, his priorities. Now, Hitler issues a New Year message in 1941, okay. Hitler states, "He who fights for the life of the nation, for a daily bread and a future will win. But he who in this war with his Jewish hate seeks to destroy whole nations will fail." How wrong Adolf Hitler is, 1942, not only for the Japanese after their swift successes, but also for Hitler's Germany. Sadly, 1942 is going to be the year of change. At the start of 1942, Germans and Italian forces who've consolidated in area of Agadir, okay, counterattack on the right flank inland to relieve the pressure exerted by the British 8th Army. Meanwhile, in Malta, Axis aircraft carry out heavy raids on the island's airfields and ports. And it's interesting, well, all these major Battles are going on. The war around Malta and other areas in Europe is still very fierce. In North Africa, garrison of Bardia, surrounded since middle of December and left without supplies or ammunition, surrenders, to the 2nd South African Division and the 1st Armored Brigade of the British 8th Army. In Malta, meanwhile, early January, Axis aircraft renew their attacks on islands, air and naval bases. And British aircraft, meanwhile, launch a raid against the town of Naples, in Italy, causing severe damage to much equipment. And, it's interesting, the British, I've always, when I was younger, reading through all the World War II encyclopedias, it's interesting, the British never received credit for that, but the British Air Force, the RAF, really carried out many raids on Italian bases, towns, ports, industrial centres, and they carried them out a lot. Again, it goes very underrung, but, the British really did cause the Italians a lot of problems. In Malta, Italian and German aircraft continue to attack military objectives on the island. They are keeping up their pressure on Malta for sure. And this is how it goes around Malta. Malta is the site of intensified air bombardments, as it is indeed on January 5th, when vicious air bombardments going from Italian and German aircraft. Now, in early January, British 1st Armoured Division, newly arrived from Britain to reinforce the 7th Armoured Division, takes up positions at Antela, in Cyrenia. Derna Harbour is reopened to traffic, and deployment of Italian and German troops along a line from El Agalia to Marada is completed. So the Italians and Germans, following launch of Operation Crusader, have formed a new defensive line. Now, in the Atlantic, meanwhile, German submarines mount their first big hunt along the eastern coast of the United States. An average of 54 U-boats are in action, and in less than a month, they sink nearly 150,000 tons of shipping. So the first major U-boat hunt along the east coast of the United States, and it results in many ships being lost. Now, in North Africa, the 13th Corps of British 8th Army sends advance units as far as Abagadia and finds the position abandoned by Rommel's forces. A convoy carrying supplies reaches Benghazi without loss. Meanwhile, in Malta, air action continues by the Axis powers. And one interesting story, British commandos in North Africa actually at one point raided German headquarters, the Axis headquarters, but luckily, for the Africa Corps, Rommel wasn't there. He was attending a birthday celebration when the British commandos raided the German command centre, so luckily Rommel was not there and thus not captured by the daring British raid. But it just shows, launching a raid against, the German headquarters in North Africa could have netted them Rommel, but just as fate would have it, like I said, he wasn't there. Meanwhile, towards mid-January, South African 2nd Division and part of 30th Corps of the British 8th Army attacks Sollum, and after 24 hours solid fighting, fierce fighting, managed to take it. Meanwhile, the Axis forces consolidate at El Agalia, their new line. They're now starting to position the units and getting ready to hold the British 8th Army and Allied forces in North Africa. So basically, also in mid-January, the Anglo-American Acadia Conference ends in Washington. Now, main decisions taken by this conference are the setting up of a Joint Chiefs of Staff Committee to coordinate Anglo-American war effort. Priority in overall operational plan is given to the campaign against Germany and the strategic importance of occupation of French North Africa. Operation Gymnast is recognised. So they're already now starting early 1942 in January to start to keep eyes towards North Africa, which of course will result in Operation Torch at a later date that we'll go through. So on 17th of January, after 2 months of resistance, Axis garrisons of Sollum and Halfaya, bombarded from land, sea and air and without water for 3 days, surrendered to British. Now, with elimination of enemy resistance in Cyrenia, the first phase of British campaign in Libya can be regarded as concluded and has been a success, albeit with some fierce fighting. The Italian and Germans are now in their new positions on the El Agalia line and just waiting and ready for the British there. So pretty much it's actually quite successful. They do achieve many of their objectives. But, Rommel and the Axis powers in North Africa have quickly set up a new defensive cordon. Now, General Auchinleck, issues new directives for the 8th Army in Africa. The objective is Tripoli. Defensive strategy is laid down in case the offensive in Libya has to be broken off. And I think this is one of those times when, the British in Africa could sometimes get a bit too confident after successes. When dealing with Rommel, you can never be too confident, as shown on January 21st, when Rommel orders counterattacks. Now, Rommel launches a three thrust from El Agalia Marada line towards Agidabia. Now, this second counter-offensive, the first was in March 1941, lasts 4 months, and there's much fierce fighting going to and fro in this Africa Corps counter-attack, I'll call it. So after initial Allied success, they are now under counterattack from Rommel. Now, Axis forces do outflank the defences of 13th Corps at British 8th Army and take Antala and Sauna. So already making gains in Rommel's counterattack. And this is how it is in North Africa pretty much. A lot of time the British would attack. Rommel would use kind of Manstein's technique. He'd re-solidify his forces, wait for British attack to calm down, then launch counterattacks. Now, in Strait of Madagascar, the first big naval battle since beginning of operations in the Pacific is had. Madagascar, of course, down the coast of Africa. Just interestingly. Now, in North Africa, a brief pause in Rommel's offensive, by the end of January. Now, British 13th Corps prepares to counterattack. If it proves impossible to hold up the enemy, the British will withdraw to a line running from Derna to El Mechili. So basically now, again, the British are already now kind of on the back foot again. Axis troops occupy Msous and move on to Regima, which is just east of Benghazi. The British 1st Armoured Division withdraws to El Mechili, leaving a detachment to protect the withdrawal at 4th Indian Division from Benghazi to Barseh. However, General Ritchie orders a counterattack in the Msous area. Thailand also declares war on the United States and Great Britain, although obviously, not much would happen there. Now, the first contingents of American troops land in Northern Ireland. The Premier of the Irish Republic, Eamon de Valera, protests strongly, but the first American troops, have now landed in Northern Ireland on UK soil. Now, in North Africa, while British 13th Corps prepares to counterattack in Msous area, the Italians and Germans resume their offensive, with great vigour along 2 tracks leading to Benghazi and El Mechili. Now, Goering, meanwhile, begins a 9-day visit to Italy, which includes talks with Mussolini. The Germans need more Italian workers in view at drain on their own manpower that they are sending onto the Eastern Front. So already, by early 1942, the drain of manpower is starting to show on the Germans. They're actually asking Mussolini to send Italian factory workers and machine workers to Germany to cover the loss of manpower. Now, Winston Churchill opens a 3-day debate in House of Commons on the war situation. Now, Churchill defends the government against critics, especially of the North African and Far Eastern campaigns. Meanwhile, on January 28th, Benghazi is now evacuated. 4th Indian Division holding Benghazi is authorised to withdraw since it will not have the promised tank support. The 7th Indian Brigade, the last to withdraw, finds the road blocked by Axis forces, but does succeed in punching through the Axis lines to rejoin the 8th Army. The German 90th Light Infantry Division and the Italian 20th Corps occupy Regima, which is further east beyond Benghazi. Now, in Rio de Janeiro, a conference of foreign ministers at American republics begin on January 15th to cement the unity of the continent, comes to an end. So even though war's going on everywhere now, Pacific, Eastern Front, Europe, there's still a lot of political wranglings going on. So in North Africa, Axis forces occupy Benghazi at first light and send advanced troops to pursue the escaping 4th Indian Division as it retires on Derna. Now, Hitler promises Rommel the rank of Colonel General. Now, Great Britain and USSR sign a treaty of alliance with Iran, by which Iran undertakes to remain neutral and will not join the war on the Axis side. British British and Russian troops will be withdrawn from the country 6 months after the end of the war with the Axis powers. Therefore, the Persian corridor is to become one of the main routes by which supplies from Western allies reach the USSR. So basically the Russians and British have said to Iran, you stay neutral, 6 months after end of war, we'll pull out and leave you to your own devices. Now, Hitler speaks on the coming 9th anniversary of coming to power, at the end of January. He calls Roosevelt a mad fool and declares, the Jews are the ones who will finally be destroyed. This war will be fought in the true biblical manner, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Well, actually, Adolf, it wasn't an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, was it? It was a huge political, maniacal bully picking on a section of people. That's what it was. Now, in North Africa, violent RAF attacks on Misrata and Tripoli. Axis troops take Basay and carry on towards Cyrene. You know, the counterattack launched by Rommel has had mad success, and the Axis are advancing almost everywhere in North Africa. In Malta, end of January, Axis aircraft have carried out during January an average of 13 air raids a day on the island. So Malta is under constant attack. Now, Great Britain recognises the independence and sovereignty of Ethiopia, which has now been liberated from Italian occupation during the East African campaign that I have covered going through this. And meanwhile, 1st of February, 1942, the Quisling puppet government is formally set up in Norway. Also in early February 1942, General Ritchie orders the British 13th Corps, which is in danger of being surrounded by the Axis forces, to retire on the Ghazala Bur Hakim line. Now, the 4th Indian Division attached to 13th Corps for Operation falls back on Derna. Having taken Cyrene, Rommel makes Derna his next objective. Malta, meanwhile, will endure another full month of air raids. The pressure on Malta is constant. Now, with both Basay and Cyrene in his hands, you see, the British attacked and had a lot of success, but Rommel has quickly got them on the retreat and quickly got them on the back foot. Rommel advances on Derna. Now, General Auchinleck, orders the British 8th Army to hold the Tobruk fortress at all costs as a supply base for future operations, because, of course, as I've covered, Tobruk has a major port. So holding on to the port and trying to keep the Tobruk garrison supplied via the port is potentially viable with British naval control. Now, Axis forces recaptured Derna already. The British 13th Corps takes up positions on the line Ghazala, Bur Hakim. Meanwhile, Axis forces are near the line Tamini and El Metchili. The British holding El Metchili, southwest of Derna, have to retire to avoid being surrounded. On coast, Italians and Germans take Mime, which is only a short way from Ghazala. In Rome, meanwhile, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem has talks with Mussolini, who's putting himself forward as a champion of the Arab cause. Meanwhile, Rommel halts. Rommel halts near Ghazala on the line of strong points and minefields that runs from Derna on the coast to Bur Hakim inland. The Axis forces stop there, having, like the British, learned not to overstretch their supply lines. So Rommel quickly recaptures a lot of territory captured during Operation Crusader. Meanwhile, in the Atlantic, ended first big hunt by German submarines off east coast of the United States that started on January the 7th. They've been campaigning there for a whole month and have sunk a lot of shipping, but that now has come to an end. Meanwhile, early February, Italian bombers attacked naval and air installations at Alexandria, the port, the Great Port, which for a long time was, I believe, the biggest port in the world, founded, of course, by the legendary King Alexander the Great, one of my boyhood heroes. Still bore his name even to this time, over 2,200 years after his death. Incredible, really. So there we have it, Now, basically, Rommel has absorbed the attack. The British have made gains. Rommel and the Africa Corps have solidified themselves on a new line, have waited while the British attack has lost some of its impetuousness, and then basically launched a rapid counterattack, threatening to encircle multiple units, making gains of land, and pushing the British back. It's great tactics by Germans that people like Manstein and Rommel would pull regular. Meanwhile, mid-February, Rommel renews his offensive after the last 2-week lull, but now Rommel again is on the move. And the British do struggle to deal with Rommel for a lot of the time in Africa. He's a very clever strategist. So General Auchinleck, in mid-February receives orders to dispatch 2 divisions to the Far East, with the growing Japanese threat. Now the British 70th Division leaves, but the 9th Australian Division stays in Africa. Meanwhile, Axis aircraft bombed Tobruk Fortress and an airfield near Mersa Matruh. Rommel called at Führer's headquarters at Rastenburg in East Prussia, asked Hitler for reinforcements, endeavouring to convince him of the importance of African front at war generally. But the Führer is now concentrating, sadly, on the Russian front and does not want his forces too widely dispersed. And Rommel is given no more than the 15th Parachute Brigade, which is sent to him from Greece by General Hermann Ramke. So Rommel, if he would have gained reinforcements, if he could have gained another motorised division or a few more infantry divisions, it's highly likely Rommel could have turned his successes into a near rout, depending on how long those forces would have took to reach there. Now, meanwhile, the British launched air raids in the area of Castelvetrano, in Sicily. You see, the British are continually keeping the Italians busy, for sure. They're keeping the Italians busy. So in a period covering up to 23rd of February, some very bad weather conditions flood into North Africa and pretty much bring a halt to most activity. But sadly not for Malta, that is being pounded multiple times every day at the moment. Meanwhile, a trial opens of war-guilt prisoners, including Daladier, Blum and Gamelin, at Riom. Which is more of a staged trial. The United States government, of course, grants a loan of $1,000 million, to the USSR in terms of military aid. Meanwhile, Air Marshal A.T. Harris takes over Bomber Command, the RAF Strategic Bombing Force. Lots of political manglings going on now. Towards the end of February, General Auchinleck, issues new directives on conduct of operations. In the event of a new Axis offensive, British troops should, in general, not try to counterattack, but should continue themselves to holding up the enemy advance as long as possible. So basically, Auchinleck, due to Rommel's rapid counterattack campaign and his success, is now ordering his troops, don't pull back, stand and fight your ground, slow the Germans down, slow the Afrika Korps down. Meanwhile, on 25th of February, Axis bombers hit the air naval base at Valletta and the airfields of Halfar and Lucca. They are pounding Malta incessantly, but Malta heroically goes through the entire war and never gets occupied. Now, the British 13 Corps, takes up positions on a line, defending the Ghazal at Bir Hakeim area. Now, the 30th Corps prepares a defensive line along the Egyptian frontier and in the Jubub Oasis, Meanwhile, British aircraft bomb Benghazi and Tripoli for the second day running. So they're certainly making a major fight of it. But, they are struggling to hold Rommel back, really. And, this is how it went. This is how a lot of it went in the North African campaign. The British would attack, the Afrika Korps would absorb, the British would get to end of the supply lines, then the Germans would counterattack. This is less of a dominant campaign than the British fought against the Italians, who were woefully under-equipped, woefully prepared and woefully commanded, wretchedly commanded, really. The British army tore through the Italians, capturing huge swathes of territory, but clearly against the more battle-experienced German soldiers fighting in North Africa. They are not quite having the same level of success. And, this is basically what the British Army had to put up with until the decisive battles of El Alamein. Meanwhile, new style RAF air raids, on Essen, the biggest city in North Rhineland. Now, the main target is the famous Krupp Armament Works. Now, this is first of a long series of night raids which reduced the city to a pile of rubble. By the end, a completely new technique of attack is tried out, with guide aircraft flying over the area first and dropping flares, followed by others which drop incendiary bombs to indicate the targets to the bomber squadrons. So basically, the British try this technique of sending in these initial craft to drop flares, so the flares can be seen. Then incendiary planes come in dropping incendiary devices to bomb these areas, to light them in flames, so then the bombers with the huge payloads of bombs can follow in like call it a third wave and just plaster bomb the entire area. And that tactic is quite devastating, and like I said, that city is pretty much reduced to a pile of rubble for the most part. Meanwhile, in early March, Winston Churchill speaks on India. Okay, so Trafford Cripps is to be sent to India to prepare the way for Indian independence. Now, some people say Indian independence was not on the cards until the British Empire could no longer hold it at the end of World War II. But here we have, in March 1942, Winston Churchill is already sending a representative there to start preparing the Indian government for independence. Meanwhile, RAF bombers attack Kiel and other targets in northwest Germany. Now, as Luftwaffe is engaged more and more on Eastern Front, the RAF is gradually winning air superiority in the west. Now, since the beginning of March, it's been carrying out a systematic offensive against German industrial centres and submarine bases in Germany, occupied France and Italy, an offensive that is to grow steadily more powerful right up until 1945. Now, in North Africa, further heavy bombing of Benghazi by the RAF, and further raids are carried out on the island of Malta. The pressure is insistent. Meanwhile, Hitler states in mid-March that the Russians will be annihilated, defeated vastly in the coming summer. He blames the halt at German thrust on the exceptionally early winter. But like I've covered on the Eastern Front, his targets and objectives for the Eastern Front will ultimately, in my mind, cost the Germans the Second World War. On the Eastern Front, I always tended to agree the best tactic in 1942 would have been to solidify the lines, re-equip themselves. They showed at Kharkov they can absorb, counterattack and rout any potential large-scale offensive. I would have done that in 1942 and then waited for the new tanks, new weapons, until the divisions were more at battle strength for 1943 to try and close Russia out. But the danger with that is Russia would have also increased in size in that time and may have been an even tougher proposition come 1943. Now, meanwhile, on Malta, the air attacks are being insistent. At last, 25,000 tons of supplies, that have been earmarked to get through to Malta. Only 20% of them, 5,000 tons, have actually got through. I've actually got through. Now, in the New Hebrides, meanwhile, American infantry and engineers arrive on Efat, to build an airfield. Already around Europe, Americans, like I've mentioned, in Iceland prior, and Greenland, and now Northern Ireland, American troops have landed there for the first time. Things are now starting to be set up. Air and naval bases are starting to be set up, for later in the war when America takes a more direct role. So in North Africa, towards end of March, to draw as many Axis aircraft as possible from a supply convoy en route to Malta, the RAF attacks airfields in the area of Derna and Benghazi. So now, let us meanwhile talk, about Operation Save Malta, the Second Battle of Sirte. So on 20th to 23rd of March, a British convoy of 4 ships, the Breckenshire, the Clan Campbell, the Talbot and the Pampas, leave Alexandria Harbour at dawn, bound for Malta, where lack of supplies I mentioned and incessant hammering by Axis air forces have reduced conditions to an intolerable level and have reduced enormously capacity of forces defending the island. Now, the convoy now leaving Alexandria is part of Operation Save Malta, an operation to get the supplies to Ireland at all costs, without which it would be impossible for base to remain in British hands, and at some point the Germans and Italians could launch an attack on Malta if they succeed in battering the defences down. Now, the convoy is escorted by the cruisers Dido, Eurofes, and Cleopatra, flying the flag of the commander, Admiral Philip Vian, and the light cruiser Carlisle, and 17 destroyers. Now, later the squadron is joined by the destroyers Legion and the cruiser Penelope, sailing from Malta. Now, in accordance with instructions, given out by the British Admiralty, every warship available at time in Mediterranean is to be enlisted in this operation. This is an all-out to get supplies through to Malta. But the movements of British ships do not escape the eyes of the Axis powers, and they draw a conclusion that the British are mounting an operation to replenish the beleaguered island fortress. So Italian naval forces, are ordered to leave port and intercept the convoy and prevent it from reaching its destination. Now, during the nights at 21st and 22nd of March, Admiral Iacchino leaves Taranto, in hail of Italy in the battleship Littorio with an escort of 4 destroyers. Now, at the same time, the cruisers Gorizia and Trento and Bande Nere were 4 destroyers sailed from Messina under the command of Admiral Perona. The Italian ships, make for the Gulf of Sirte, where the Italians calculate that they will catch up with the British ships approaching. Meanwhile, on 22nd of March, the Italian submarine number 79 torpedo planes attacked the British formation, making for Malta, but failed to scatter the convoy or hit any of the ships. Unlike British torpedo attacks by swordfish bombers on Italian ports, the Italians haven't done a very great job there. At 12:40 p.m, on the same day, the pilot of a reconnaissance aircraft sent up from the Trento reports having sighted the Allied convoy and that it's sailing without air protection. So in his account of battle, Admiral Iacchino wrote, "For the first time on March 22nd, 1942, our naval forces found themselves confronted by an enemy formation which was not protected from the air, which in fact was unable to call upon any form of air-naval cooperation." So at 2:40 p.m. on 22nd of March, Admiral Perona's cruisers, which are ahead of Iacchino's squadron, sight the British cruisers and open fire, but the convoy, is well protected by a smokescreen and escapes damage. About a quarter of an hour later, the Italian Admiral breaks off the engagement. They just have no success because of the smokescreen. At 4:31 p.m. on 22nd of March, one of British cruisers is sighted by Littorio, the Italian battleship, but weather and sea conditions are not favourable, as they were a few hours earlier, when sadly the Italians were stopped from their attack by the smokescreen. Now, meanwhile, Allied ships have put up an effective smokescreen behind which they have disappeared, and into which it would be dangerous and both useless to follow them for the Italian ships to go, since they're not equipped with radar. You see, the British ships are equipped with radar, so the rough seas and the smokescreens mean that the Italian ships could literally run into each other, and without the benefit of radar, they would have no idea where they were going. They could also run risk of hitting anything else. Nonetheless, Italian ships open fire on the enemy cruisers whenever they appear from smoke screens. In one such sortie, Admiral Vian's flagship, the Cleopatra, is hit. Now, at 6:35 p.m, Italian ships have reached the point at which interception at enemy convoy for Malta is planned to take place. Now, Admiral Vian accepts the challenge and immediately sends his destroyers against the Italian battleship Littorio, hoping at least, to cripple the Italian battleship with torpedo attacks. Now, the Italian battleship manages to take evasive action, but fearing another attack, and because it's getting dark, which again, the lack of radar will pretty much hurt them, she turns away and steams north. Now, rest of Italian squadron follows in the wake of the flagship. So basically, the Second Battle of Sirte saved Malta. The Italians picked up on the movements of the British convoy, tried to engage them once, had no effect, tried to engage them a second time, but were delayed and stopped by use of an effective smokescreen. And then, when there was no smokescreen in another area, the seas were unfavourable for combat. So the Italians had not really much success. And the first real British attack back against the Italian battleship Littorio, it turns round and goes away, and thus the other Italian ships do as well. Now, that is the end of Operation Save Malta, the Second Battle of Sirte. The damage caused to ships engaged is negligible. There's one hit by a shell on the Littorio, one shell each on the Cleopatra, Euroclylus and the Kingston. The 4 merchant ships are untouched, and Admiral Vian has thus completed his mission and can leave the merchant ships to reach the harbour under the cover of darkness. Again, the Italians cannot pick the ships up at night due to no radar. So by 23rd of March, although they've proceeded at full speed throughout the night, the 4 merchant ships fail to reach the shelter of Malta before dawn, and at dawn they are attacked by Axis aircraft that have been laying in wait. So the Talabot and the Pampas are hit, having reached port, and sink before they can be unloaded. The Breckenshire goes down, having almost reached port after being towed in, and the Clan Campbell is sunk 50 miles of Malta, and thus only 5,000 tons of the supplies supplies of the 25,000 I mentioned actually succeed in getting through. So even though the attempted attacks by the Italian Navy against the British Navy were a total failure, the miscalculation that the merchant ships could reach Malta's port by morning under cover of darkness, those calculations were off, and sadly daylight hitting those ships was still at sea, and the Axis aircraft were just flying the area waiting for them to show up. So Admiral Cunningham wrote later, the Axis force have largely achieved their objective of preventing supplies reaching from the island, which in turn leaves Malta in an extremely dire situation. So basically, there we are. There's the second battle of Sirte. So King Boris, leaves Sofia for Berlin, where he'll meet Hitler. Now, the meeting, like others were leaders of the vassal states, is interpreted as a demand for additional manpower for the coming German offensive in Russia. Now, as we know, Italy, Romania, Hungary all increased their numbers on the Eastern Front in preparation for the summer offensive of 1942. But it makes no mind, really. The Germans are still going to be hit with a similar problem. Can they overrun their objectives prior to the Russian winter? How stiff will Soviet resistance be? And ultimately that will slow down and stop them. Meanwhile, let's talk about a raid by a British force on Saint Nazaire on the 26th of March. So at 3 p.m, a small British force consisting of 3 destroyers, 1 gunboat and several motorboats and motor torpedo boats with groups of commandos on board sails from Falmouth Bay in Cornwall for the French coast. Now their objective is the important German submarine base at Saint Nazaire, the French port situated at the mouth of the Loire estuary. On 27th of March, the following day, the British forces nearing Saint Nazaire. At 11:30 p.m. on 27th of March, British aircraft supporting commando operation against Saint Nazaire bombed the German Atlantic naval base, but don't cause any major damage at all. The following day, on 28th of March, the British ships enter the Loire estuary and slowly approach the port, avoiding enemy observation. And then at 1:34 a.m, the destroyer Campbelltown, loaded in bows with several tons of explosives intended to be detonated the next day, rams the dock gates at the naval base. Now this caused a massive explosion. The explosion causes extensive damage to the docks and kills many Germans who've climbed on board, but this is the only real substantial result of raid, and it's been achieved at considerable losses in men and materials. So really the accident of ramming the doors with all the explosives on is the best success there. So during the night of 28th of March, 234 aircraft of Bomber Command carry out a heavy air raid on the town of Lubeck on the Trave estuary, some 10 miles from the Baltic Sea. Now the raid destroys many ancient buildings and monuments and gives Hitler an excuse for recalling 2 groups of bombers from Sicily and ordering them to carry out reprisal raids on a number of historic cities, including Exeter, York and Canterbury. This was a problem in Battle of Britain. Churchill knew in my mind that if he bombed Berlin like he did in that small attack really in scale, but one that had a massive psychological effect on Hitler, that he changed the operation from destroying the RAF to reducing British cities to rubble. The British have kind of pulled it again. They launched this raid, and then that makes Hitler pull bombers from the Mediterranean front to launch retaliatory strikes, but those bombers would have been more effective in continuing the pressure on Malta and other areas. So RAF air superiority in Europe is of course by now firmly established due to increasing demands at Eastern Front on Luftwaffe resources. Now, meanwhile, 29th of March, 1942, the British government constitutional proposals for India are published. They state that India is to have full dominion status after the war, basically saying that India will be freed and put under their own control after the end of the war. And at the request of King George VI, the 29th of March is observed as another national day of prayer. King George VI there ordering some prayer time during this increasingly vicious conflict. So in Malta, okay, 2 submarines are sunk by Axis torpedo planes. Now, during coming month, Axis planes dropped more than 6,500 tons of bombs on the island of Malta. Now, the air defence at Ireland comprises only a few Hurricanes and Spitfires, although these do manage to check the enemy's fighter bombers during April. They do shoot down at least 37 Axis aircraft, and often these planes are then damaged and repaired, often while Malta is still under air attack later. Sometimes the planes are being repaired while the bombs are dropping. It really is remarkable. But this is only one aspect of a critical situation in which British find themselves in the Mediterranean. They've only got 4 cruisers, 15 destroyers against the enemy's 4 battleships, 9 cruisers, 55 torpedo boats and more than 70 submarines. Now, with such tremendous numerical superiority, there's a very real risk of an Axis invasion of Malta. Now, King George IV sends tribute to Malta's heroic resistance to Ireland's Governor Lieutenant General Sir William Dobbie and announces he has accepted the colonelcy in chief of the Royal Malta Artillery. So I will end part 1 of Africa and Europe, complete World War II there. Part 2 coming very soon. I'm out.